If he defeated the rebels, he would be given the international political sovereignty of this region.
I think Sadok was most important because it was such a symbolic event. The hauling of the cannon was epic in its nature.
Some even are furious with the Brooks because the divide and rule is started by the Brooks actually.
They established dominance in this Crown region, and he was their leader. And then suddenly there was this encroachment by a foreign power, so to speak.
The Raja has been imposing taxes in Rentap's area, and it created resentment amongst the locals.
Rentap was one of the last Iban leaders not to accept James's control. He had this dire sense of autonomy and independence. He wouldn't kowtow to the Raja.
There have been 2 previous expeditions made to crush Rentap, but to no avail.
He had a small band of followers relative to the size of Sarawak. He wasn't a threat to Kuching or to government or the idea of government. He was a threat to the idea that government could protect you. If Rentap was raiding at will on Lingga and Sabuyao or into Kuching, then government of course would fall.
Now James has entrusted his nephew Charles to defeat Rentap and his men once and for all.
Rentap perhaps had 24 followers in this fort, Bukit Sadok, which was deemed impregnable by local people, and according to local warfare, it was probably pretty difficult to take.
In October 1861, Charles and his army begin to make a move to Rentap's well-defended fortress on a mountain. This is the Battle of Mount Sadok. Deep in the jungles of Mount Sadok lies a fortress built by a brave Iban warrior and his men, who have challenged the Sarawak Raja's authority for years. The conflict between the Iban warrior Rentap and the Raja has come to a boiling point in October 1861. The Raja's nephew Charles Brooke and hundreds of his army are deployed to Mount Sadok with heavy armories.
Charles Brooke had a locally made howitzer by Chinese smiths, hauled by 500 of his followers, by Malays and Dayaks and Chinese, up the mountain, up Bukit Sadok.
I think Sadok was most important because it was such a symbolic event. The hauling of the cannon was epic in its nature. He's going to win this one by hook or by crook.
On the fateful day, the 2 sides engage in a fierce battle. However, Rentap's fort cannot withstand the intense attacks from the Raja's firepower. The Mount Sadok fort is hit by the cannon, and the walls eventually give way. But Rentap manages to escape before he can be captured by Charles's army.
Charles later wrote about Rentap and his great respect for this formidable adversary. He made efforts in the early days to broker peace with Rentap, and Rentap, from his own perspective, didn't want to be a part of this state of Sarawak. And I think Charles Brooke respected Rentap and respected his worldview, but it was untenable in the context of the nation states. He needed to prove that he could protect his people in this nation state, and so he had to destroy Rentap's power.
I would say that the Iban actually respect the Rajas. Probably they didn't really like what Raja did to Rentap. But that gave them that realization that, okay, we had a Raja whom we should respect because he managed to even overpower our chief warrior.
With the threat of Rentap eliminated after the battle at Mount Sadok, Charles's uncle, Raja James Brooke, has grown old and resides mostly in England. He has handed over his rule of Sarawak to his two nephews, Charles Brooke and John Brooke, or commonly known as Brooke.
Now, in the early 1860s, there was a trial of strength, and this happens in almost every dynasty in history, that the successor can never live up to the ideals of the person who is handing over to them. And so James Brooke wanted to do things the way he wanted to do things. He was the old man at this stage with the experience, and the Raja Muda, Brooke, we'll call him, wanted to do things differently. But from England, James would interfere, as old men often do, and eventually Brooke challenged him and said, I've taken over, I'm doing it my way, you've already handed over to me, essentially, and I have the support of the local people.
Outraged by his elder nephew's constant challenges, James makes a drastic decision.
And so James Brooke went to Sarawak, an old man, a fairly frail man, and got as far as Singapore, and Brooke met him in Singapore. And James met with him, and he banished him on pain of death from ever returning to Sarawak, and confiscated all his belongings back to England.
As John Brooke's authority comes to an end, his younger brother Charles Brooke is the obvious heir to the throne.
James Brooke certainly saw himself as a ruler in Kuching with a lot of, obviously, the support of the local Malay community, but Charlie was the chief of the Dayaks. So I think that probably made it an easier decision for James later on to leave Sarawak in Charles's hands.
Years after the struggle to determine succession, James Brooke dies of a stroke in 1868. He is buried in the village of Sheepstore in the southwest of England. His nephew, Charles Brooke, is proclaimed as the second Raja of Sarawak. As he takes over the throne, Charles Brooke establishes his own way of ruling.
During his rule, he had that privilege given to the Iban. Other indigenous groups were paying taxes, but the Iban, they didn't have to pay that much as the other indigenous groups. He was thankful to the Iban. He believed that the Iban must have helped him in so many ways.
From one area to raid the other area and so on. The divide and rule, it started by the Brokes actually.
In a way, they actually approved of head takings, and it was indirectly rewarded if the expeditions were successful. So meaning that the Rajas did not say anything about head takings during the expedition.
This exception creates resentment among many river communities who are not aligned with the Brooke administration and become victims of indiscriminate violence by Charles's army.
He certainly had moments of crisis of conscience about that, but he didn't see himself as controlling them, I don't think. He could ask them, please don't take more heads than you need to. But ultimately they were going in one direction with one purpose, and the Iban would do what the Iban wanted to do.
Charles Brooke pushes further his agenda to establish a nation state by bringing the communities together and making them forgo certain age-old traditions.
What the government had to prove is that it could rescue you from that state of perpetual warfare. And the peace ceremony was a symbolic face-safing exercise, I suppose, where the two parties would come as equal partners, not by vanquishing one another, but by voluntarily coming and exchanging gifts and marrying into each other's families and so on.
He was also very good on administrative detail. He was the one who really organized Sarawak into a government and gave Sarawak its current shape, geographically, politically.
Charles also continues his Uncle James's policy of self-dependence, but he wants more autonomy for Sarawak. He detests the interference of foreign European companies who look to take advantage of lands in the region.
He saw that his people, as he had found them, were much happier than the industrial working classes of European cities, and he didn't want to change that by bringing in great investment into the country. He would compare it or contrast it with the British Empire, of course, in India, where it was at its worst in his eyes. And he deplored this idea that Britain governed its colonies by power and not by friendly intercourse of feeling, by personal relationships. And it was the personal relationships that held Sarawak together.
As Charles gets more support of his rule from the local people, he expands Sarawak's dominion in Borneo. He begins to seize territories from the Kingdom of Brunei.
Charles Brooke saw Brunei as a failed state. He didn't feel that the Sultan's authority was recognized by the local population because they were in open rebellion in most cases against the Brunei authorities who'd been placed there. His expansion of the nation state, this model state that he was trying to create, meant absorbing more and more of Brunei, would have eventually absorbed Brunei itself, would have absorbed by purchase Sabah, modern-day Sabah, which he offered and had accepted to buy from the North Borneo Company, which he saw as one of the great evils of capitalism.
However, the British are increasingly concerned with Charles's ambition.
I think Charles Brooke was seen as somewhat uncontrollable. He had made it clear that he was not a British puppet.
To stop his expansion, the British offered Charles legitimacy to his rule through a treaty.
And in that treaty, Sarawak became a protected state, and they're quite different legal definitions. A protectorate has an understanding that you have your resident advisor whose advice must be acted upon. A protected state is almost unique, that it had its own internal sovereignty with no British influence. It guaranteed in international law, which hadn't otherwise been recognized by the British, that Sarawak was a sovereign state.
To Charles, the chance to acquire legitimacy of his rule is one too good to be declined.
The 1888 treaty was a brilliant diplomatic coup for Charles. It put him in a negotiating position of equal status with the British Empire. It protected Britain from Charles Brooke giving Sarawak to somebody else. And I think most importantly, from a British perspective, it contained Sarawak.
The 1888 treaty is a triumph of the Brooke rule under Charles. Sarawak is finally recognized as sovereign in the eyes of the British and the international community. By the end of the 19th century, Southeast Asia is flourishing due to trading activities by colonial powers in the region. But the second Raja of Sarawak, Charles Brooke, is concerned that Sarawak's strategic position will fall prey to the greed of colonial hegemony.
His greatest fear was that strangers and speculators would come into the country after he couldn't protect it any longer and would exploit the local people, would deprive them of their birthright, of the land on which they lived. And so, of course, his fear was to have the right successor.
Charles's immediate successors are his two sons, Vyner and Bertram. But he is not confident that his elder son is up to the task.
It was one of those dynastic conflicts in the Brooke family that you find in lots of dynasties, where two brothers are up for inheritance. The elder gets it because he's the elder, but doesn't really want it. And the younger doesn't get it and really wants it.
Vyner challenges his father on occasion, giving grounds to Charles's doubts. He now considers handing over his throne to his second son, Bertram.
And he called Bertram to him and said, "I'm going to make arrangements to disinherit Vyner, and would you be willing to take over?" And Bertram wasn't ruthless enough to do what his father had done to his brother and to usurp his brother's position. And so they came to a compromise. And the compromise was that he would leave the sovereignty to the two brothers equally, and they would rule 6 months of the year and pass midstream.
After the arrangement is made, Vyner Brooke becomes heir to the throne, with his younger brother Bertram ruling half of the year. In May 1917, sad news befalls the Brooke family. The second Raja of Sarawak, Charles Brooke, who has ruled Sarawak for 50 years, has taken his last breath in England. His eldest son, Charles Vyner Brooke, is proclaimed the third Raja of Sarawak. But Vyner is unlike his late father.
I think he had no great wish to be Raja, but I think his feelings of perhaps not being loved as much as the younger son meant that he wasn't going to just give it up. He wasn't going to allow his younger brother to have that. It was all that he had, his only recognition. And so he became a disinterested ruler, a hands-off ruler, and allowed other people to effectively rule for him.
Charles Vyner Brooke transferred his authority to the Council Degree, and these Council Degree members are not elected. They are appointed by him, mostly the British colonial government, civil servant.
Decades of economic isolation by the white Rajas is taking a toll on the people of Sarawak.
The Brookes almost kept Sarawak as a personal zoo, and they kept out all of the major commercial enterprises. So economically, Sarawak was very underdeveloped.
There was no road, hardly any road, except for just a few one around Kuching. There were hardly any school, except for one or two. So generally, most of the people of Sarawak were still illiterate in some ways.
However, in 1941, Vyner Brooke introduces a major change in his government. Sarawak will have a new constitution. The year 1941 also marks 100 years of Brooke rule.
Charles Vyner Brooke is the present White Raja, and as the Raja and his Rani arrived by state barge from the palace for the centenary celebration, 101 guns sounded the centenary salute.
The new constitution is based on the 9 cardinal principles, stemming from the ideals of the first Raja, James Brooke.
They were an articulation of principles that had been enshrined in James Brooke's day. James Brooke had his code of laws, he had his wonderful ideals and quotes that we can reference. Charles Brooke ruled by these principles, but none of it was articulated as a formal constitutional document. So I think what Vyner did with that act in 1941 was to articulate it in a way that people could understand. This is what Brooke government is about. This is what Sarawak is about.
The Malays, who were mainly the D rulers, they were very happy with the 1941 constitution. A promise of democratization, a promise of doing away with autocratic rule by Brooke, and the promise of educating the masses so that they can rule themselves.
One of the promises in the new constitution is self-governance. As co-ruler of the state, Bertrand Brooke champions this idea, but he believes Sarawak needs more time to develop before any decision can be made.
He just saw the realities of knowing Sarawak. He was born in Sarawak, he was a Sarawakian, he'd been ruling for 30 years, 6 months of the year, and he saw that thrusting democracy on a people can lead to exploitation. It would take generations to bring in education around what democracy truly means.
The promise of independence by Vyner Brooke has given hope to the people of Sarawak that they will truly have a voice in the future of their land.
The Brooke rule for 100 years. We had peace in this country, we had law and order, we expanded to a state. Sarawak was, in fact, a stable country. No more wars, no more fighting.
Since the first Raja, James Brooke, started his rule in 1841, Sarawak had expanded and is finally on the path to become an independent nation. After 100 years, that idea is becoming a reality for many in Sarawak. With the Raja's proposed constitution comes the promise of a new future.